Good morning. Today we are going to talk about the Guadalcanal campaign, the first campaign in World War II. We will begin by exploring how the Japanese and the American navies and the U.S. Marines envisioned fighting the next Great War during the interwar period of 1919 to 1940. Then we will examine the first year of the war in the Pacific to gain an understanding of how it turned into a war of attrition with many indecisive engagements. Following the Russo-Japanese War, both Japan and the U.S. came to view the other as the most likely enemy in any future war in Asia or the Pacific. The Japanese believed that the key to their national survival and greatness rested on their ability to secure vital natural resources in China, French Indochina, Malaysia, and the Dutch East Indies. They understood that seizing these assets would not only entail a war with Britain, France, and the Netherlands, but would also with the United States, as the Philippine Islands constituted a major obstacle to any Japanese drive to the south. The leaders of the U.S. Navy and U.S. Marine Corps understood that their greatest challenge was projecting and sustaining combat power across the Pacific and developed their strategic concepts and technological innovations with this in mind. Their overall plan was a drive starting on the West Coast and Hawaii, going through the Central Pacific to the Philippines with an ultimate destination of the seas around Japan. Much like the Japanese peers, U.S. Navy planners envisioned that the war would be decided by a decisive naval battle in Japanese waters. The Japanese were well aware that they lacked the resources to fight a long attritional battle against the greatest industrial power in the world, and that the U.S. Navy outnumbered their own. They knew, however, that the U.S. would face grave challenges in sustaining its operations across the vast Pacific Ocean. As such, the Japanese Navy envisioned fighting an interception and attrition strategy in the Pacific, which consisted of the following tenets. Japan planned to use the Japanese mandates, a series of former German territories from New Guinea to the Marianas, which they gained after World War I as forward operating bases. The Japanese Navy planned to intercept and track U.S. naval forces sailing from the West Coast and Hawaii using a submarine screen. The submarines would sink as many U.S. ships as possible, combatant ships that is, and harass the U.S. fleet throughout its passage, continually updating the Japanese fleet on the progress and strength of the Americans. The Japanese planned to use carrier aviation to further attrit the U.S. fleet. As the Americans sailed through the islands of the Japanese Mandate, land-based aviation would continue to whittle away at the American strengths. When the depleted U.S. fleet entered Japanese waters, the Japanese anticipated that the combat ratio between the two fleets would be roughly equal. The Japanese Navy envisioned that the war against the U.S. would culminate like the decisive naval battle of the Tsushima fought in the Russo-Japanese War in 1905. Japan maintained their qualitative advantages in technology, training, and national spirit, and that would lead to their victory in the sea engagement. The war then would end in a negotiated settlement. To give them the war they wanted in the interwar period, the Japanese Navy invested in long-range submarines, lethal torpedoes, carrier aviation, and super dreadnoughts. They also instituted tough and realistic training to give their forces asymmetrical advantages over their enemies in night fighting and aerial combat. Their hope was that Japanese quality would overcome American quantity. Tenets of the U.S. naval strategy. While the Japanese believed that the war would end in negotiation, the American strategy was centered on economic strangulation from the sea. By first defeating the Japanese fleet, then enforcing a blockade of the Japanese mainland that would ultimately force the Japanese to sue for peace. In 1919, the Chief of Naval Operations directed Marine Corps Commandant John Lejeune to begin planning for amphibious operations in Central Pacific to secure logistics bases for a war with Japan, despite the conventional wisdom after the 1915 Gallipoli campaign that attacks against defended beaches would become bloody debacles. Like the Japanese, the U.S. Navy also sought interwar innovations to achieve their vision of the next war. Fearful of Japan's growing air threats, the U.S. Navy placed ever greater emphasis on carrier aviation and long-range submarines during the interwar period, but still, the U.S. Navy continued to view the battleship as the key combatant of their fleet. To extend the reach of the fleet, the Navy perfected the difficult task of supply and fuel replenishment while underway. Furthermore, the Navy pushed the field radar sets on its ships to aid in fire control and detection of enemy forces. Despite the interwar planning by both Japan and the U.S. as tensions grew, new events required both sides to adjust their strategies, first with an oil embargo imposed on Japan by the U.S. in July 1941, which pushed the Japanese towards military action. Then the U.S. faced the increasing possibility of a war with the Axis powers and Japan simultaneously. Surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. In an effort to seize the resources it needed to fight a modern war and cut down the Americans' growing naval superiority, the Japanese attacked the American fleet on 7 December 1941 and simultaneously struck American, British, and Dutch possessions in the Asia and Pacific. The more optimistic voices inside the Japanese military believed that these strikes would quickly force the Western powers to negotiate. Others believed that expanding the Japanese defensive perimeter would at least give them the space and time to execute the interception and attrition strategy. Unfortunately for the Japanese, they underestimated the resolve of the Western powers and the anger that their attacks would generate in the U.S. Far from setting the conditions for a short war and a negotiated peace, the Japanese attacks hardened American will while only temporarily howling the ability of the U.S. to wage war. America got caught by surprise, although War Plan Orange accepted the likely loss of the Philippines. The size and scope and audacity of the Japanese attacks caught the Americans by surprise. The rapid loss of Guam, Wake Island, and the Philippines, and the destruction of the American naval power in the Pacific also threw the American plans into disarray. The German and Italian declaration of war against the U.S. in the wake of Pearl Harbor committed the U.S. to fighting a global war. After the fall of France in 1940, Franklin Roosevelt and the U.S. Joint Chiefs decided upon a Germany first strategy for any war in Europe and the Pacific. This, along with the loss of much of the Pacific Fleet and the time it was taking to mobilize the nation for war, meant that the first year of the war in the U.S. in the Pacific would be fought on a shoestring. Going for the decisive blow, Chief of Imperial Japanese Navy Admiral Yamato pushed for attack on Midway to force the U.S. Navy to fight to protect Hawaii and the West Coast, in which he got. The Battle of the Midway on 4 June 1942 was a major defeat of the Japanese Navy, where they lost 6 carriers, 4 of the 6 fleet carriers that day. This setback put pressure on the High Command to regain the initiative in the Pacific, starting with the capture of New Guinea and pushing toward Fiji. Note, Guadalcanal was not a priority. Japan's challenges on Guadalcanal. The 1st Marine Division conducted its first assault on Guadalcanal on 8 August 1942. Communication between the Japanese Army and Navy was virtually non-existent. Because the Japanese Navy initially downplayed the size of the American forces on Guadalcanal, the 17th Army at first only sent a small force, the Akechi Detachment, to push the Americans off the island and piecemealed further support. This allowed the U.S. time to consolidate its foothold on Guadalcanal in the first months of the battle. By the time the Japanese realized the seriousness of the situation on Guadalcanal, the Americans had placed Henderson Field into operation. Thus, the American foothold forced the Japanese to change their operational focus. This specifically played out with the 17th Army in New Guinea about to capture the key town of Port Moresby, had to divert forces immediately to Guadalcanal. So without much forethought from the Japanese, Guadalcanal became the focus of their efforts in the South and Central Pacific and consumed increasing amounts of irreplaceable troops and material. Impasse at the top. In the wake of the heavy U.S. Navy losses and the increasing demands of Guadalcanal, a rift was growing among the U.S. Joint Chiefs and senior theater commanders to call it off. George Marshall and Hap Arnold argued it was diverting from North Africa. Nimitz believed it hindered his naval sweep across the Central Pacific. CNO, Admiral King, and MacArthur argued Guadalcanal was vital to driving the Japanese from the South Pacific. In the face of such a high impasse, the decision ultimately ended up in the president's desk. So Roosevelt looked at it as Guadalcanal was the first major U.S. offensive of the war and still burned the desire to exact a vengeance on the Japanese. Roosevelt believed that a withdrawal or even a prolonged stalemate on the island would be a blow to national morale. On October 24, 1942, Roosevelt directed the Joint Chiefs to reinforce Guadalcanal immediately. The war envisioned in pre-war planning was nothing like the war that was fought. No great decisive sea battle, not a war of super dreadnoughts or battleships deciding the day. Instead, the aircraft carrier became the decisive combatant and the battleship was relegated to a supporting role. The Pacific War was a grinded-out war of attrition, of island hopping in malaria-infested jungles that began in Guadalcanal. In such attritional struggles, victory generally goes to the side that can continue to feed resources into the fight while inflicting losses on the enemy that surpasses its ability to reconstitute its forces relative to one's own. Thank you for watching this video.